My stepmom tried to kick me out of the house after Dad died. She said, "It's my house now." I discovered a hidden will that changed everything. My dad always told me that I was a fighter, his little lioness, since the day I was born. He said I'd come into this world with a howl, and I guess I never really stopped fighting. I grew up learning from him how to stand my ground, and I think that's why losing him was such a shock. But if I'm honest, it was also why I could never fully trust Odette, my stepmother. And by the end, that instinct to fight would become the only thing standing between me and homelessness. Odette came into our lives when I was about 12, and my dad was grieving the loss of my mom. She had this way about her that seemed so perfect, too perfect. She was from Lyon, France, and even though she'd been in the States for a while, she still had a thick accent that I'd see people swoon over. Dad included. She was like a character out of a novel with her elegant scarf wearing and stories about life in Europe, dropping French phrases into conversations like it was just the way she thought. It was easy to see why Dad was drawn to her. She seemed like a breath of fresh air, a promise of something new after all he'd been through. At first, I tried to accept her. I was a kid who'd just lost her mom, and seeing Dad happy again felt good. I'd try to get close to her, ask her about her life back in France, about her family, her childhood. She'd give me these careful smiles, and her answers were short, almost rehearsed. It wasn't that she was unkind, no, she was smart about that. She just had this subtle way of making me feel like I was intruding on something private. Things started to shift as the years went by. Little things. She'd give me a look if I left my shoes by the door or if I forgot to clear my plate after dinner. If I asked for money for school or clothes, she'd sigh just loud enough for me to hear, making me feel like I was a burden. Dad was oblivious, as dads often are. He'd just smile at both of us, say something about his two favorite girls, and Odette would beam at him, all sugar and light. But when Dad wasn't around, she'd turn cold again. She had this thing where she'd say my name in a way that felt dismissive. "Lisette," she'd say, drawing out the last syllable, "you need to pick up after yourself." Or, "Lisette, don't you think it's time you found something to do with yourself?" Like I was just a visitor in my own home, a nuisance she had to tolerate. Still, I dealt with it because I loved my dad, and as long as he was happy, I could put up with her. I moved to Boston after college and got my own place, which made things easier. I didn't visit much, only on holidays or the occasional long weekend. Dad and I stayed close, and I could see him without the shadow of Odette hovering around us. Then, 3 years ago, Dad got sick. I'll never forget that phone call. "Lisette," he'd said, his voice shaking, "it's cancer." The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. He didn't go into details, but I knew it was bad. I took time off work and went back home to help however I could. But from the moment I arrived, it was clear that Odette had everything under control, or at least, she wanted me to think so. "You don't need to worry about a thing," she said, meeting me at the door with a tight smile. She had this air of composure, like she'd already decided how things were going to go. "I've been handling his medications, appointments, everything. He's in good hands, Lisette." I bristled. "Odette, he's my dad. I want to be here for him too." She sighed, just loud enough for me to hear. "Of course, chérie," she said, brushing her hair back with a manicured hand. "But you must understand, he needs consistency. Too many people around might stress him out." Her words stung. It felt like she was trying to push me out, keep me on the sidelines, and I knew better than to question her when my dad was around. She'd look at him with these soft, tearful eyes, put on a performance that would have made any actress proud. And Dad? He was eating it up, thanking her endlessly for being his rock, his angel. I tried to swallow my frustration, but it wasn't easy. As the weeks went by, I noticed things that didn't sit right with me. Odette made all the decisions. She was always the one talking to the doctors, adjusting his medications, even planning his meals. She'd call me distracting when I'd ask about his care plan or try to bring him things from outside. It felt like she was managing him like he was her project, not her husband. I had no idea how much worse it would get. One day, Dad was lying in bed, and I was sitting beside him, holding his hand. He was weak, his face pale, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Lisette," he said, his eyes unfocused, "I need you to remember something for me." "Anything, Dad," I said, squeezing his hand gently. He opened his mouth to say something, but Odette swooped in just then, all efficiency and control. "Time for his medication," she said briskly, stepping between us and effectively ending the conversation. She shooed me out, saying, "It's best if you don't exhaust him, Lisette. You know how fragile he is right now." Her words ate at me. I knew she was trying to keep me out, but I had no proof. All I could do was sit in the next room, listening to her bustling around, clinking bottles of pills and whispering softly to him. It was infuriating. Then, one cold October morning, he was gone. I felt hollow, numb. I stayed in the house with Odette for days, mostly because I couldn't bear to leave. The grief was crushing, and being surrounded by his things, in the place he'd built, was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Odette kept her distance, barely speaking to me unless it was necessary. It was as if she couldn't wait for me to leave. But I wasn't ready. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, she came in and sat across from me, folding her hands in her lap like she was about to deliver some bad news. "Lisette," she said, her voice soft but steely. "I think it's time we talk about the house." I felt a pang of dread in my stomach. "What about it?" She tilted her head, giving me that infuriating, condescending smile. "Well, this house. It's mine now." I blinked. "Excuse me?" She sighed, as if I were a child who just didn't understand. "Your father left everything to me. It's only fair. I was his wife, after all. This house is my home now." I stared at her, stunned. "But this was my dad's house. Our house." "Yes," she said, leaning back and crossing her arms, "but he left it to me. I'm sure he'd want you to understand. After all, you have your own life in Boston. You're a grown woman now." The word sliced through me. My dad wouldn't have done that. He knew how much this house meant to me. I could feel my hands shaking, but I did my best to keep my voice steady. "I want to see the will." She blinked, a flash of annoyance crossing her face before she smoothed it away. "There's no need for that. The will is private. You'll just have to trust me." "Trust you?" I spat, unable to hide the anger creeping into my voice. "After you've done everything to keep me out these past few months? I have a right to know what my dad wanted." Her face hardened. "Lisette, don't be so dramatic. Your father and I had an understanding. He trusted me to make the best decisions for this house and for you." "I don't believe you," I said, my voice rising. "I want to see that will." She stood up, towering over me with a look that was equal parts anger and pity. "You can't just come in here, demanding things, Lisette. You have no idea what your father went through in his final days, and I was the one who cared for him. Not you. Now, I'm asking you to respect his wishes and move on with your life." I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "If this was his wish, then you won't mind showing me the proof." She huffed, exasperated. "Fine. If you insist on making things difficult, I'll show you the will. But I'm warning you, Lisette, this won't change anything." She left the room, and I sat there, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. I knew my dad, and I knew that he wouldn't have left me with nothing. There had to be more to this story, and I was going to find out. Over the next few days, I did some digging on my own. I started with the paperwork in Dad's study, combing through every drawer, every file, looking for anything that might give me a clue. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle, but I was determined. Odette didn't know it yet, but I wasn't going anywhere. And then, late one night, as I was sorting through an old box in the attic, I found it, a handwritten document, dated a year before my dad had even been diagnosed. It was a second will, clearly written in his familiar handwriting, stating that the house would be left to me, his daughter. I stared at that document in my hands, barely able to believe it. The house was supposed to be mine. My dad had written it down, clear as day. He must have known, somehow, that Odette might try to push me out. Maybe he'd seen glimpses of her true nature all along. Or maybe he just wanted to make sure I had something to hold on to when he was gone. Clutching that will, I felt a surge of determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I made my way downstairs, the document folded neatly in my bag. Odette was sitting in the kitchen, sipping her coffee like she didn't have a care in the world. She barely looked up when I walked in. "Good morning, Lisette," she said in that sing-song voice, barely hiding her smugness. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk." She looked up, surprised by the firmness in my tone. "Oh? About what?" Without a word, I pulled the document from my bag and set it down on the table in front of her. She squinted, then picked it up, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock. I watched her face go pale as she read my dad's words, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. "What? What is this?" she stammered, her voice wavering. "That," I said, savoring the moment, "is my dad's real will. He left this house to me, not you." She shook her head, disbelief clouding her face. "This can't be. This isn't legal. It's not notarized." I smirked, the bitterness finally finding an outlet. "Actually, I spoke with a lawyer. In our state, a handwritten will like this is absolutely valid, especially when there are suspicious circumstances, like someone preventing me from seeing the official paperwork." Odette's face twisted in anger, but she was scrambling now, clearly off balance. This is absurd. You don't know what you're doing, Lisette. You're just a child." "A child?" I shot back. "You've tried to erase me from my own family. You tried to push me out of my dad's life, out of his house, even out of his memory. Well, I'm done playing along with your games." I didn't wait for her to respond. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer, setting the wheels in motion to contest her claim to the house. For the next few weeks, the house turned into a battleground. Odette fought me tooth and nail, refusing to accept that she wasn't the rightful owner. She hired a high-powered lawyer, tried to make it look like I was some greedy daughter after her father's money. She even spread rumors around town, painting herself as the poor widow being unfairly targeted. But my lawyer was good, and he didn't let any of her nonsense go unchallenged. We had the second will, which was a powerful piece of evidence. My lawyer also uncovered other documents my dad had signed over the years, showing that he'd intended to leave the house to me all along. Odette's lawyer tried to argue that my dad was influenced by me, but that fell flat. It didn't take long for the judge to see through her lies. At one point, I found myself sitting across from her in a courtroom, both of us waiting for the judge to return with a decision. She wouldn't even look at me, but I could see the rage simmering just under the surface. Finally, the judge walked back in, shuffling a stack of papers, and cleared his throat. After reviewing the evidence and hearing both sides, he began, "It's clear to this court that Mr. Rivette intended for his daughter, Lisette, to inherit his home. The handwritten will, combined with the supporting documents, leaves no doubt of his wishes. I'm ordering that the property be transferred to Ms. Rivette immediately." I couldn't help but let out a small, triumphant sigh as the judge spoke. I glanced over at Odette, and her face had gone an alarming shade of red. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. For a moment, I thought she might explode right then and there, but instead, she forced herself to stay quiet, her expression icy. After the ruling, Odette had 30 days to pack her things and leave. I was at the house every day, watching her sulk through the process of boxing up her stuff. She tried one last time to appeal to me, showing up in the kitchen as I was clearing out some of my dad's old things. "You know," she began, her voice a soft, defeated whisper, "I did love your father. I did everything for him." I didn't even look at her. "Did you? Because I think you did everything for yourself, Odette. If you'd really loved him, you wouldn't have tried to cut me out." She fell silent, but I didn't stop. "You wanted control. You wanted everything he had. Well, guess what? It's over. You don't own this place, and you never will." She left without another word, and I didn't feel the slightest bit of guilt watching her go. In the weeks after she moved out, I took my time putting the house back the way I wanted it. I repainted the rooms, getting rid of the muted grays she'd chosen. I hung back up my dad's old fishing pictures, framed some of his favorite quotes, and even made a small gallery wall of our family photos. It was healing, piece by piece. Then, about a month after Odette was finally gone, I discovered something else. I was cleaning out the garage when I found an old metal box tucked away on a high shelf. Inside were bundles of old letters, photos, and a series of bank statements. My heart stopped when I realized that the bank account wasn't just my dad's. It was a joint account with Odette. She had been transferring small amounts of money from his personal account to hers for years. Thousands of dollars, all trickling out over time, so that he'd probably never noticed. My dad hadn't just been betrayed in death, he'd been used by her for years. And she'd been hiding the money. I couldn't help but smile as I thought about it. Here was my sweet revenge. I called my lawyer again, showed him the documents, and asked what my options were. Within a week, we'd filed a case against Odette for theft, fraud, and a whole list of other charges. She'd drained money from my dad's account while he was alive, and now she'd pay for it. It was a long process, but we won. The court ordered her to pay back every penny she'd taken, plus damages. She was left with almost nothing, and I heard from mutual friends that she'd moved back to France, utterly disgraced and defeated. Her dreams of a cushy retirement were gone, just like she'd tried to steal mine. And as for me? I stayed in my father's house, rebuilding it, piece by piece, to honor him. Every time I walked through those halls, I felt him there with me, proud of the fierce lioness he'd raised. The house was truly mine, and I knew I'd never let anyone take it from me again.